Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of UPSC Civil Services Examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 7th of June 2021. The articles which we are going to cover today have been displayed on the screen, and so let us now begin the discussion.
Since February pact, it's all quiet on the line of control. And it highlights the fact that there has been no exchange of fire nor infiltration attempts from across the line of control for over 100 days since the commitment by India and Pakistan to adhere to 2003 ceasefire. And this is quite a great achievement for both the countries to be able to maintain peace along line of control. Now, line of control is just one of the lines or one of the boundaries which separates India with its neighbors. When we go through the disputes with China, we get to hear about line of actual control or LAC. Then there is something which is called actual ground position line. Then of course you have international borders of India. And now when aspirants start preparing, newspapers generally do not describe these terms. And so that is why in today's discussion, we will go through the detailed analysis of what these four different kinds of terms mean actually. And just not for the sake of doubt clearance, it is also an important part of your syllabus under GS paper 3. Under the section security, the syllabus says security challenges and their management in border areas, linkages of organized crime and terrorism. And how will you understand this topic unless and until you understand different kinds of borders which India has? And so let us now begin the discussion. And so let us start by understanding the simplest of these, which is international border. And so, as the name itself suggests, it is a line or it is an area which has been accepted by both the countries to be a border. The country A having absolute sovereignty towards this side, B having this side, and this will be international border. And so, there is no ambiguity or there is no doubt as to which place or which location on the map belongs to which country. There is absolutely no confusion over the territorial control as far as these two countries are concerned. Only then it is characterized as an international border. And so, the best example of an international border in case of India would be Radcliffe Line. Through our knowledge of history, we know that Radcliffe Line actually divided the British India into India and Pakistan, of course later on from which was derived Bangladesh. And so let us now move on to the map and do some practical work and try to locate the Radcliffe line on India's map. And so when we talk about India-Pakistan border, the Radcliffe line starts somewhere over here, it goes here, and then it ends. Then another portion of Radcliffe line divided India and Pakistan, which later on became Bangladesh. And so these two are the original remnants of Radcliffe line, which mark the international border of India with that of Pakistan and that of Bangladesh. If we have to be more precise, then international border between India and Pakistan starts in Gujarat and ends at Akhnoor sector in Jammu and Kashmir. And since this is a mutually accepted border by both the countries, it has normal mechanisms to solve day-to-day issues. For example, some person might be crossing the international border, and so the repatriation of that person back to the original country. Apart from that, there are certain checkposts. There are transport lines through which the railways and the buses can cross through. All this available on the international border, normally just like any other international border, and similar is the case with international border with Bangladesh. And so that's why this section with Pakistan never observes any kind of firing, because firing is a result of a dispute between two nations. And so generally this is completely peaceful border, the border with Punjab, the border with Rajasthan, the border with Gujarat. And so that is why these borders are generally not guarded by Indian Army, but rather they are guarded by border security forces, both along the India-Bangladesh as well as India-Pakistan border. And since they allow normal transport of people, and so that is why they also have normal checkposts. And as I've said, since they are normal borders, there are setups for immigration as well as custom controls, because the exchange of not just people but also goods take place from time to time. Of course, since last 2 to 3 years, most of the activities even along the international border between India and Pakistan have been suspended, but nonetheless, they are the accepted borders between India and Pakistan. Now, whenever we talk about the border between India and Pakistan, there are two more components to it. One is line of control and another one is actual ground position line. And to be able to understand what these means, I would like you to go back some time in history, the time of partition, 1947, and you might recall that India and Pakistan entered into quite a bitter war immediately after independence, right? So when India and Pakistan entered into a bitter war just after independence, and as soon as the war stopped mainly because of the intervention from international community, a ceasefire agreement was signed between the two nations. Along with the ceasefire line was a truce. And so this ceasefire line, which basically means that the person will stay wherever they are, but they are not going to fight further. And so that is what a ceasefire line is, which was accepted as line of control. Because that is line which might not be acceptable to both the nations, but that is the line which actually on ground the two nations are controlling. So just after the independence, a lot of territory of Jammu and Kashmir, or the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, was captured by Pakistan. Although Indian army was quite successful in pushing back these Pakistani quite a bit, but before they could be completely pushed into the Pakistani territory, a ceasefire was called, and so Indian army had to stop pushing them back. And so if we zoom it in, we'll see the line of actual control looks something like this. So you have international border, and then as soon as international border ends, you have the line of actual control starting right from the Akhnur. And so this region of Jammu and Kashmir beyond the line of actual control is known as Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Now there are two things which are important, which you should note very, very distinctly over here. First and foremost is the term itself. Line of control is a very particular and specific term denoting only this particular line starting from Akhnur and going up to Siachen Glacier. And this particular term cannot be used for any other particular section of border of India with its neighboring country. Although it is a ceasefire line, but it has been delineated on map, which means that both the armies have a map in which they have agreed that these are the points which when connected give result to the line of actual control. Not just that, these agreements have been signed by both the armies. Now there is a difference between an agreement on a border signed between the armies or among the armies and from among the nation states. And this is what a basic difference between international border and non-international border is. And so you can say that line of actual control is kind of a practical arrangement on ground among the militaries of the two countries. But having been delineated on map and having been agreed by both the armies does not implies that it is agreeable condition or situation as far as both countries are concerned. It is still disputed. We still show Pakistan occupied Kashmir in the map of India, which basically means that we do not as of now agree to this particular line as international border, and so it is not a permanent border according to both the countries, but they have agreed to maintain status quo for at least some time to come. Of course, it has lasted for 60 years. Where this line is located could also change, or it could also transform itself into an international border. You never know. So after having understood international border and line of control, it's time for us to understand this last section of India-Pakistan border, which is actual ground position line, which is basically the line which divides India and Pakistan as far as the control over Siachen Glacier is concerned. It extends from northernmost point of LOC, which is the point NJ9842, and extends up to Indra Kol. Now, if you try to understand it on map, there is a point on LOC known as NJ9842 where the ends, beyond which this whole region which I am shading in green color was simply not delineated because it is so inhospitable that no one thought anyone could even claim the control over there, or could even go there because it is Siachen Glacier. And somewhere around here is Indra Kol. And a straight line connecting these 2 points is actual ground position line. On western side sits Pakistan, and on eastern side we have complete Siachen Glacier to our control. So when we talk about India's border with Pakistan, it consists of international border, with blue color, line of control with black color, and finally the blue color actual ground position line. And so we are left with only one kind of border, and that is line of actual control, which is used to refer to the disputed border which we share with China. And so when we have discussed line of control which has been delineated on map and have been signed by both the armies, But in case of line of actual control, it has never been put on map. And if you are going through newspapers every day, you know that is the actual problem. Chinese lie claim to a territory which India does not agrees to. India sends troop to a region which China says belongs to them, and that is happening only because this particular line or a boundary has never been put on map. There is no agreement between these two countries as to where the actual control should lie as far as both these nations are concerned. And so this particular line of actual control remains ambiguous even as of now. If we talk about its segregation, it is divided into three sectors: Eastern, Middle and Western. The Eastern sector, which spans Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim, the Middle sector in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, and the Western sector, of course, in Ladakh. However, the line of actual control in Ladakh region does not conforms with the political map of our country which you are habitual of seeing. It runs something like this, with Aksai Chin controlled by China. Although it has never been put on map, but there is some kind of agreement to actually decide some of the points, and that was done in 1993 through agreement to maintain peace and tranquility. Through this agreement, India and China decided to maintain status quo on their border pending any eventual boundary settlement. So boundary settlement has not taken place, but until then the status quo will be maintained. Wherever the person is sitting will keep on sitting. But that does not prevent one country from imposing their own perception of line of actual control on the other country. And that is the basic reason why we are having so many scuffles between India and China. So I hope that this discussion would have cleared some of your doubts related to different kinds of borders which India shares with its neighbors. Let us now move on to the next news. The next news which we have taken up appears on page number 1. Punjab, Tamil Nadu and Kerala top education index ranking. So Punjab, Tamil Nadu and Kerala have all scored higher than 90% in Education Ministry's performance grading index for 2019 and 2020, which was released just yesterday. And you can see on the map that except barring very few states, most of the states have scored above average, which is quite a satisfying finding of this particular index. Now, as far as the basics of this particular index is concerned, the report or the PDF is still not out there on the ministry website or on PIB's website. And so we will wait for that particular notification to be able to tell you about the exact criteria of the index. But we can utilize this opportunity to discuss a very important topic from the perspective of mains examination, and which is under JS paper 2 UPSC expects you to have a clear-cut understanding about issues relating to development and management of social sector or services relating to health, education and human resource. And so we will utilize this opportunity to understand the challenges of India's primary and school education. And then we will understand what national education policy has to say about improvement of school education in our country. Let us now begin the discussion. And so overall challenges being faced by the primary education sector of our country can be categorized into three main points. First, of course, deals with the expenditure or the low amount of money which the government is spending on this particular sector. And the second and third are related to the outcome. One of them is gross enrollment pattern, and the second one is the quality of education which is being imparted, especially in the government schools of our country. And so let us now understand each one of them. We know that social sectors in our country receive less attention as compared to other similarly situated countries like Russia, Brazil, South Africa, and that is also reflected into our social indicators. For example, the best would be to look at Human Development Index. Now, since last 60 years, the governments, various governments, around 10 governments since then, have accepted that India needs to invest around 6% of GDP on education. Every national education policy since 1968 has said that. Even after the reassertion so many times in every budget, what is the current number? The current number is dismally 3.1%. And it's not like it has started to increase. If you look at the pattern in last 1 decade or 2 decades, it's almost static, increasing by maybe 0.1 or 0.2% every year. And you should note that this is the total amount of expenditure on education sector and not just on primary, because apart from primary education, we have higher education as well. And remember, in India, government spending on school education is mostly for government schools and a small portion goes to government aided schools. And so private schools do not receive any amount of government funding. Of course, they receive some of the fees for students belonging to economically weaker families under right to education, reservation of 25% of seats in private schools, but apart from that, no help from the government. So what this does, first and foremost, it leads to poor, very poor, dismally bad infrastructure and facilities in our government schools. Now, a study of 188 government-run primary schools had found out that around 59% of the schools had no access or did not have facility for drinking water. That's not as bad because you can carry your own drinking water in your own bottle. But what is even worse is that around 90% of the schools did not have functional toilets in them. Similarly, a data released by National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration revealed that only 3.5% of the primary schools in Bihar and Chhattisgarh had toilets specifically for girls. So most of the schools do not have gender separation as far as toilets are concerned, and that is definitely a big problem or a hurdle to fill the gender gap in education. We'll come to that later. Apart from primary schools and secondary school, we have Anganwadi centers which are being operated under Integrated Child Development Scheme, which mainly focus upon preschool education and nutrition. And we have separately discussed it in DNS how their condition is. And so you can see that along with schools and Anganwadi centers combined, the overall expenditure on education is very low, which leads to quite poor infrastructural conditions in our institutions. Then let us now discuss the gross enrollment pattern. So gross enrollment ratio is nothing but number of students enrolled in a given level of education regardless of age, which is expressed as a terms of percentage. So if you have to calculate the gross enrollment ratio, you have to divide the number of students enrolled in a given level of education regardless of age by the population of the age group which officially corresponds to the given level of education and multiply it by 100. Quite confused, right? So let us now understand. Let's say if there are 115 kids studying in class 1 in a particular locality, and you know that the actual age of a person or expected age of a person to be studying in that particular class should be 6 or 7. Let's consider for an example that 7. Now in that particular locality, how many kids actually are age 7? And that would obviously be in most cases less than 7. Let's say if it is just 100, which means that there are 15 more kids in that particular class than it should be. What does that mean? That means that there are some elderly people who have just started to receive education and are in class 1, which is actually quite good thing. And so that is why when we look at the statistics, it's more than 100 in case of India after 2004. It has crossed 100 and it is always higher than 100. If we talk overall school enrollment in our country, it's more than 100%. That is obviously very good. But what is bad is high dropout ratio. And so the multiple graphs which you see on your screen show the dropout rates in 3 important sections of our school education: 1 to 5, 1 to 8, and 1 to 10. And you can see that as you go higher, more and more people tend to drop out from our education system, which is quite a concern. Not just that, if you look at vulnerable sections belonging to SC and ST as compared to the general population, the dropout rates are very high. Also, the dropout rates among the girls is equal or less than the boys, which actually is not good thing, because to start with, less number of girls are already entering into the system. So obviously the dropout rates among them have to be lower. And then finally move on to the most important aspect of the education, which is the quality itself. And we know that this is the cause of concern for all of us. And the poor quality of education is reflected in the education attainment of these students, in the cognitive skills which they are gaining in the schools. It is very clearly and unambiguously reflected. And for this we are going to take help of the report released by NGO Pratham, which comes up with ASER report or ASER report, which collects data on the schooling or preschooling status of children in the age group of 4 to 8 years, and which is quite relevant for us and our discussion. And so the graph which you see on your screen is basically the graphical representation of one of the very key points of ASAR report. Children in government schools who can at least read a grade 2 level text. Grade 2 level text should be read by everyone in class 2nd, or at least the ones who have passed on or graduated from class 2 to class 3. And look at what is the reality. Only 9.3% of the students in class 2 can read class 2 text. Only 20% of the students in class 3 can read their last class text, which is class 2. And forget about that, less than 50% of the students in our schools who are right now in class 5, less than 50% can actually read class 2 text. This is the condition or the quality of education being imparted to our students. So there is a clear-cut mismatch with the curriculum expectations, definitely. Then our country has a very unique feature of very, very high student to teacher ratio. Now if you focus on this image over here, in the best states, one teacher handles around 10 to 25 students, which are of course Kerala, Rajasthan, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Odisha. While in Uttar Pradesh, a teacher has 106 higher secondary students under his care. And so you can see that not only there is a wide diversity, but we know that most amount of students are enrolled in state boards of UP, Jharkhand, Bihar, West Bengal, where the most care is needed. The situation is actually the worst. And the reason behind that is the distribution of expenditure across functional areas. So if 100 rupees is disbursed by the state government for primary education, how much of that is going into teacher's salary? How much is that is going into maintenance of the buildings? How much of that is going into administration of the school? And so if you look at that, you find that large states like Bihar are actually giving out 72% just in teachers' salaries, and they are left with only 18% to be spent on improvement of infrastructure of the schools. And now this is not the right situation. Look at Rajasthan, 92%. So which shows that the capital expenditure on the infrastructure of a school is nil, because of which you will know that the building is not going to be expanded, or neither it is going to be improved. So there are not going to be more classes. Since there are not going to be in more number of classes, all the students which enter into, let's say, class 1 will have to sit in a particular classroom, and so that is going to increase the pupil is to teachers ratio anyways. Then there are challenges with accreditation as well. So accreditation is a process through which a school becomes recognized by some or the other official agency. Once you are accredited, only then you can award the degrees of 10th and 12th, which are actually the milestones of our education. Now the problem with our country is that around 90 to 95% of the students are graduating from government schools, which are accredited to government agencies. For example, state boards. Now there are a lot of issues with these agencies themselves. Not only they operate in opacity, they don't change the syllabus for a long time to come, and so their overall approach and functioning does not reflect the changing time, and so that is why our education gets stuck in time. And so for a lot of these issues, our National Education Policy 2021 has talked about at least 4 of the challenges, and let us now discuss them. Now, first and foremost, it is important to know that this policy aims for universalization of education, but this universalization of education is not new. You already know that through RTE, the education has been universalized, but that is the school education. But a watershed moment in India's education scenario is that this particular policy will aim to universalize education from preschool to secondary level with 100% gross enrollment ratio by 2030. By attempting to achieve this, National Education Policy 2020 will bring 2 crore out of school children back into the mainstream through open schooling system. Also, the National Education Policy is going to replace the current curricular structure, which is based on 10+2 setup. So you can say that current curriculum is fragmented into 2 parts, till class 10 standard and then 11th and 12th. But now the government is going to break down this curricular structure into 4 parts, which will be named as 5+3+3+4. The first 5 years shall be 3 to 8 years. Next 3 years will be 8 to 11, then 11 to 14, and finally 14 to 18 years respectively. Now, the rationale given by the government is that this will bring hitherto uncovered age group of 3 to 6 years under the school curriculum, which has been recognized globally as the most crucial stage for development of mental faculties of child. Now you might ask that what about the initial preschool education where that shall be given, and that shall be given in Anganwadi centers which have already been opened by the government. Now under this new curriculum there is going to be few foundational changes in the way we educate our children. Now if you are reading newspaper, you must be following the reports on education released by an NGO called Pratham, and the reports are known as ASAR. And you must have seen that how the students of class 5 were not able to solve the mathematics and vocabulary questions of class 2, which means that there is a lot of deficit in our educational achievement, and hence under the new education policy a special emphasis shall be laid on foundational literacy as well as numeracy. So now you can see that how actions of non-governmental organizations impacts the functions of the government. Because had it not been for the rigorous and the serious attempts made at formulating these reports, our government policy making would not have focused on the foundational numeracy and literacy. Also, the government is going to do away with the rigid separation between academic, extracurricular, as well as vocational streams in schools. And vocational education will be started from class 6 in all the schools along with the internships. Now, continuous evaluation as well as the training of teachers is equally important. And hence, National Curriculum Framework for Teacher Education or NCFTE 2021 will be formulated by NCTE, which will be done in consultation with NCERT. And the idea is that by 2030, the minimum degree qualification for teaching will be a 4-year integrated B.Ed degree. And one of the highlighting features of this particular policy dealing with the school education is its emphasis on the language of instruction, and that shall be mother tongue will be made compulsory for instruction method for teaching up to at least grade 5. And also the national education policy clearly highlights that no language will be imposed on any student. So now you can understand that how important was the inclusion of these issues into national education policy. Of course, not only these steps will enable better learning outcomes for our children, but at the same time, they are going to go a long way in assuaging the doubts of a lot of regional political parties. So these are the important provisions dealing with the reforms which has to be brought about in school education through NEP 2020. So it is always a good idea to start with constitutional provisions regarding anything related to polity, social issues. You should be well aware of the articles and the provisions dealing with almost anything given in the UPSC syllabus. And since we are discussing education, it is important that we look at various articles and provisions related to education in our constitution. So starting with the fundamental rights. Article 15 talks about prohibition of discrimination on various grounds, and this is applicable to educational institutions also which are partially or fully run by the state. And in that, if you focus on clause 5, which was inserted by 93rd constitutional amendment, it talks about advancement of any socially and educationally backward classes of citizens or the citizens from scheduled tribes and scheduled caste sections, as far as that advancement deals with their admission to educational institutions, including private educational institutions, whether aided or unaided by the state, other than the minority educational institutions given in Article 30. So you can see that although this particular article is focused on advancement of education of a particular classes of citizens, but nonetheless, they are the ones who have been denied, and hence it makes sense. Then of course Article 21A, which was inserted by 86th Constitutional Amendment of 2002, which talks about the right to education, where the state shall provide free and compulsory education to all children of the age of 6 to 14 years in such manner as the state may by law determine, and hence a law was enacted to ensure ground implementation of Article 21A. Then Article 28 although deals with freedom of religion, but it also talks about educational institutions where freedom as to attendance at religious instruction or religious worship in certain educational institutions. Then cultural and educational rights of Article 29 and 30 are very important. Because under clause 2 of article 29, no citizen shall be denied admission into any educational institution maintained by the state or receiving aid of the state funds on the grounds only of religion, race, caste, language, or any of them. So these provisions have been included to ensure that no children belonging to a particular group of our society is deprived of education. Similarly, Article 30 gives right to all minorities, whether based on religion or language, to establish and administer educational institutions of their choice. Then we move on to the part 4, which is directive principles of the state policy. In this, Article 45 and Article 46 talk about education. Article 45 focuses on early childhood care and education for all children until they complete the age of 6 years, whereas Article 46 talks about promotion of educational and economic interests of scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other weaker sections. Then we don't have to forget fundamental duties, that is part 4A of our constitution, where the subsection H talks about development of scientific temper, humanism, and spirit of inquiry and reform, which directly deals with the education. And then finally, the last fundamental duty talks about duties of parents and guardians to provide opportunities for education to his child, or as the case may be ward, between the age of 6 and 14 years. This was also inserted by 86th Constitutional Amendment of 2002. Then the next set of instructions related to education has been given in Article 350 and 351. So Article 350A facilitates or ensures the instruction in mother tongue at primary stage. It calls upon the state to make sure that every local authority within the state provides adequate facilities for instruction in mother tongue at primary stage of education to children belonging to linguistic minority groups. And Article 351 gives directives for development of Hindi language, according to which it shall be the duty of the Union to promote the spread of Hindi language. So these were the constitutional provisions with respect to the education. But what about the administrative setup, or what about the division of the responsibility between union and state? And as you know that is decided by the provisions of the 7th schedule. So let's now understand various provisions of the 7th schedule to get a better idea as to whose responsibility it is to educate Indians, whether it is state or center or both. So here we are with the 7th schedule. So as you know that there exists a set of universities known by the name of central universities, for example Banaras Hindu University, Jawaharlal National University, or Aligarh Muslim University. So any institution declared by Parliament by law to be an institution of national importance comes under the purview of Centre and is governed by the provisions of List 1 of Schedule 7. Similarly, institutions for scientific or technical education financed by Government of India wholly or in part and declared by law to be institution of national importance. For example, IITs, IIMs, Indian Institute of Science Education and Researches, NITs, Indian Institute of Science. So all these institutions come under the umbrella of central institution and they are governed by central government. Similarly, Article 65 talks about setting up of agencies by the union government for professional, vocational or technical training, including the training of police officers. As you know, there is a police academy in Hyderabad. Then it enables the central government to establish and run an institution for the promotion of special studies or research, and it does the same for scientific or technical assistance in the investigation or detection of the crimes. And similarly, entry number 66 talks about coordination, determination of standards in institutions for higher education or research and scientific and technical institutions. And for that purpose, you have a lot of organizations, for example, CSIR, UGC, all have been set up and run by central government. So this is it as far as the list 1 is concerned. So you can see that a very small subset of overall education comes under the purview of central government, or you can say the center, which mainly deals with research, higher education, coordination, collaboration, and few central universities. And now we move on to the state list, where the entry number 12 tangentially talks about education because it gives the powers to the state to set up libraries, museums, and other similar institutions controlled and financed by state. But this is the only provisions which directly gives powers to the states as far as education is concerned. And let us now look at the provisions of concurrent lists, that is the list 3, wherein the entry number 25 talks about education, including technical education, medical education, and universities, subject to the provisions of entries 63, 64, 65 and 66 of list 1, which we have already discussed, as well as vocational and technical training of labor. So power dealing with education has been given both to center as well as the state. Similarly, entry number 26 talks about legal, medical and other professions. So according to this, both center as well as state government can take necessary steps for development of legal field, health field as well as other professional fields. So we saw that list 1, which is also the union list, demarcates the exclusive responsibility of the central government. Similarly, list 2, which is the state list, specified the functions and responsibility which shall be performed by state governments. And list 3 is concurrent list which specifies the joint responsibilities of center and state government. So in overall, the central government formulates the general policies and gives directions as well as the financial aids, and responsibility of implementing these policies is shared by both center and the state. And let us now move on to the reference section. Why we did not cover 2 or 3 important news. For example, diminishing options appears as a column on page number 6. And this particular column talks about the RBI's latest policy statement and how it underscores the diminishing options available to RBI in order to address the economic fallout from COVID-19 pandemic. And so the complete article is dedicated to the RBI's policy statement, which was of course covered in great detail by Baswa sir on 5th of June 2021. And it would be really unfair to you guys if I cover something which has been already covered by Baswa sir. So in the DNS, he covered all the announcements, starting with announcement number 1, which talked about Resolution Framework 2.0 for COVID-related stressed assets of individuals, small businesses and MSMEs. Then he discussed the second important announcement, which was about how RRBs will be allowed to issue certificate of deposits. And then finally, announcement number 3, National Automated Clearing House has been made functional on all days and liquidity facility for contact intensive sectors have been enabled. So if you have not already gone through this particular lecture, go through it again. And whenever you have to revise basics of economy, it is advisable that you go through the same lecture, because apart from the RBI's announcement, it contains a lot of basic stuffs which often perplex aspirants. So DNS dated 5th of June 2021 is to look for. Then the next column has also been left, that is media and sedition, which again appears on page number 6. Now this topic of sedition has been discussed on 1st of June by me, where we started by discussing the historical perspective of sedition law in India, what actually sedition means, what is the reason behind frequent appearance of sedition in the newspaper, and that is related to the misuse of the powers given to the state governments. Then in the same discussion, we also went through 2 important cases, Kedarnath Singh versus State of Bihar and Kanhaiya Kumar cases. These are the 2 important judgments which have put some kind of limit on the state power as respect to the usage of sedition. And then finally, we went over as to the points against and in favor of keeping sedition as a law in continuance as far as Indian perspective is concerned. So 1st June 2021 is the one to look out for the discussion on sedition.